This is a lecture about the legacy of America during the Cold War and beyond. And in many ways, this encapsulates the future of America. What is America going to look like in the 21st century? Now, the focus of this lecture is on America as an actor, but the themes of this lecture resonate on a much broader level, on a global level. In many ways, this lecture is about the end of American hegemony. The question of whether we've reached a point where America is no longer going to be the sole superpower in the world. And so this really affects global affairs as well. So the subtitle of this lecture is America in the World after the Cold War. Now, there's no pictures for this lecture, and there's no keywords because this is going to be such a bird's eye view of history that if you want to turn off the video and just listen to the sounds, that would be just fine. Now, a Cold War scholar by the name of John Lewis Gaddis wrote a book in the 1980s where he said that during the Cold War, there was a long peace. It's called the long peace thesis because he posited that there was no great power war during the Cold War. Sure, the US and the Soviet Union came really close to blows at several points, not least over the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s, when the Soviets moved nuclear tipped missiles into the Western Hemisphere, and Kennedy and the Soviets managed to climb down from that situation without there being a war. There's all sorts of conflicts where the US and the Soviets almost got dragged into those types of situations. And sometimes it wasn't even just the US and the Soviets themselves that got dragged into that situation, but it was third party countries, smaller countries that made really big impacts on the global stage and kind of forced either the Soviets or the Americans' hands. To give you guys an example, the most populated country in the Middle East, Egypt, and the leader of that country, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had this massive following in the 1960s in the Middle East, managed to create this war in 1967. It's called the 6 Days War, where he basically forced the US and the Soviets to choose a side between him and the Arab states and Israel. And this is an instance where the Soviets and the US almost got pulled into a direct war because of their client states, because of their partners. So the Cold War was really fraught with all of this danger, and especially the nuclear question that hung over everyone's head. But miraculously, there was never a great power war. The last so-called great power war was the Second World War, so 1945. Now, you had wars, right? I just mentioned, the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. So we had wars during the Cold War. The superpowers themselves, America and the Soviets themselves got into wars, right? America got bogged down in Vietnam, for example. The Soviets got bogged down in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and some people call that the Soviet Union's Vietnam War. And for both of these superpowers, those wars, Vietnam and Afghanistan, really sapped their power and energy and will to kind of be a superpower. I mean, there's this period of the 1970s where it seems like the US is on the ropes in terms of global affairs. I mean, it's really easy to take this for granted now because we know what the history is after the 1970s. But for a time period during the 1970s, it seemed like the US was no longer a hegemon. Certainly not the top hegemon. The um, Reagan administration and the Ford administration, which took over for the Nixon administration, I meant to say, and the Ford administration, which took over for the Nixon administration after Nixon had to leave office after committing an illegal act. They both reached an accord with the Soviet Union whereby each power was going to limit each other's nuclear capabilities and non-nuclear capabilities as well. And there was a sentiment that the US had to do this in the 1970s because it was so weak after the Vietnam War. Now, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, said, no, we're not weak. This is just smart politics. We're going to have an intelligent policy where we're not competing with the Soviets. I mean, no one wants there to be an outright war. But there was a sentiment that that was just kind of covering for what was really American weakness in the 1970s. And this was compounded by America's sort of complete routing by the Middle Eastern um, oil exporting states, because these states launched an embargo on oil after the 1972 Arab-Israeli War, often called the Yom Kippur War. And this really demonstrated the the limits of American power. The fact that you could have these other smaller states make decisions that could have such a large impact on the United States was just shocking, especially, like I said, compounded with America's loss in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam really was a loss. So there's a lot of soul searching in the 1970s for the United States. And there's this kind of sense of upheaval in the world in general in the 1970s, as everyone's trying to make sense of the new sort of order of things. Now, when Ronald Reagan came into the presidency in the 1980s, he changed America's strategic outlook. He changed America's posture because he was frightened by how the United States had really allowed itself to become strategically outmaneuvered by the Soviets as a result of Nixon and Ford's strategic arms limitations agreements. He looked at these agreements and he said, well, the Soviets are cheating. They have many more weapons than we do, and this is a problem. And he was right. The Soviets had been cheating. And so he talked this really tough talk, and people thought that there was going to be a war. But really what he was doing was utilizing this concept called peace through strength, where he wanted to kind of threaten the Soviets realistically enough to a point that would bring them to the negotiations table. And after a series of 4 Soviet leaders dying one after the other, I mean, it was really crazy. 4 Soviet leaders just died one after the other while Reagan was trying to launch these talks. Finally, he met a partner in Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s, and the two of them reached an accord. And there's this sense that, and I guess there's this kind of debate of whether the U.S. won the Cold War, whether Reagan's tough talk and peace through strength posture really forced the Soviets to the table because they thought, my God, this is a madman and we can't defeat this madman. And he's really ramping up American production of nuclear weapons. And he's launched this crazy idea of a so-called Star Wars missile defense system. But at the same time, the Soviet Union was also collapsing under its own weight. And some people credit this to the strategy of containment that was launched at the beginning of the Cold War in the mid-1940s, early 1950s. A man by the name of George Kennan, who said the Soviet communist system is just not in congruence with the Russian spirits with Russian society. And eventually Russians are going to wake up to this and they're going to overthrow this system. And when they overthrow this system, the entire Soviet empire is going to collapse. And he based this off of reading a book. I mean, he was an expert on Russian affairs. Don't get me wrong, but Kennan read a book, just a really famous book about Russia in the 1800s, and he derived all of these lessons about Russian society from the book. And based off this book, he said, we've got to wait out this collapse. We don't need to engage the Soviets because they will crumble from within. And a lot of people think that Kennan was vindicated by what happened in the 1980s. That it took a lot longer than he envisioned, but the Soviet Union eventually did collapse. And so there's all of these components that go into it. But coming out of the Cold War, there's this sense of renewed American strength. You know, however one views the historical end of the Cold War, and I don't think we can credit it only to the American posture under Reagan. I think there's a lot of other factors that go into it. There's no denying the fact that people just felt like the United States was unstoppable at the end of the Cold War. And so a lot of people sort of mark the year 1989 as the end of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union officially dissolves by 1991. Now, in 1989, under a sort of really intense feeling of jubilation, of jubilee, a political scientist by the name of Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay called The End of History. And a lot of people really misunderstand this essay and think he literally said there's going to be no more history. What he said is that the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism was the last ideological struggle that humankind was ever going to endure, because there was no better system for the governance or the economic governance of mankind than capitalism. And communism presented the greatest threat to that. They were both products of the Enlightenment, communism and capitalism. They were both trying to better the individual and kind of free them from a lack of self-identity. And with the end of communism, there was no longer a threat. It was clear that capitalism was the main driving force of human innovation, and every country would eventually go that way. That was Fukuyama's end of history. And under that postulation, he said there's going to be no more Great War. The long peace was going to be extended. Not only had there not been a great power war during the Cold War, but there was no reason for any country to fight a war against, or any great power country, that is, to fight a war against each other, because when you fight wars, it impacts your economy in a negative way, because you have disruption of trade, etc. And politics gets really messy during wars. And so he said that was going to be the end of great power conflict indefinitely. And he said, sure, you'd see some conflicts here and there of smaller states kind of throwing off their traditional yoke and moving towards a more Western capitalist system. And that type of conflict would be kind of localized and expected, but by and large, there was an end of ideological history. A lot of people felt like there was a lot of validity to that argument. And he was so ebullient, so jubilant about this thesis that it was really infectious. A lot of people just really changed their outlook as a result of Fukuyama's end of history thesis. And if you get a chance to read it, it's a brilliant essay. It's still a really exciting essay to read. The thing is that Fukuyama wasn't the first person to make this thesis. In fact, for the last 500 years, somebody has made this thesis almost every 100 years. Almost every 100 years, some scholar um, says that there's humanity has reached the pinnacle of innovation, that there's no longer going to be any great power conflict. So Fukuyama's only been the latest scholar to make that guess, and we know that that really hasn't panned out. But that we'll get there. That's more recent history. Now, the 1990s the world kind of operated under this assumption that it was a unipolar moment. A conservative columnist by the name of Charles Krauthammer declared in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs magazine that it was a unipolar moment, that it was no longer a bipolar world divided between the Soviets and the US, that there's only one power. And not only was there one power, but this was a really rare instance in world history. There was very little instances in previous history where you had one power, have one country have so much power concentrated in their hands. And so that, with the end of history thesis, really led to this foregone conclusion that the US was just an unstoppable hegemon. And the 1990s really kind of seemed to support that thesis, because you had a number of interventions in the Balkans, which had been the cause of World War One, mind you, right? I mean, the conflict in the Balkans was responsible for a lot of the great powers getting, really riled up and getting kind of sucked into all of these events that they could have stopped but chose not to stop, and eventually led to World War One. And in the 1990s, there was a bunch of events that seemed to be following a similar kind of pattern, and the Europeans turned to the US and said, "We are powerless to stop this. There's genocide going on in our continent. Will you stop this? We can police it afterwards, but we're powerless to stop it ourselves. We lack the capabilities. Can you do this?" And the US did it. And there was a sense that the US was a benevolent hegemon as a result, that it was a hegemon that used its power for good, because the US really did stop genocide from being carried out in the Balkans. Now, the shocking end to all of this, as you might expect, and I suppose many of you don't recall these events, but they're more historical for you. Some of you might be as old as me and might have memory of these events, but the not so surprising ending at this point is 9/11, right? September 11th, 2001. And I still remember that morning. It was a perfect morning, to be honest. It was one of those mornings that stood out in my mind because it was a beautiful September morning that was kind of like what they call an Indian summer day, where it's really warm. It's got just the perfect weather early, so you can kind of be outside before the early afternoon, and this is going to be a really great day. Clear blue skies. It was kind of the beginning of the school year. Just a really perfect morning. And I remember getting ready for school, walking down and seeing the Twin Towers, smoke coming out of them on the television. I think it was on CNN, and it was such a shock. And the morning just changed, and the whole day just obviously changed. And when I say it was a perfect morning, I mean it started off as a perfect morning, and obviously it turned into kind of a really nightmarish day. There's a lot of history that paints that moment as an unexpected moment. And I have to say, as someone who was alive, but not very aware of history at that point, I think that's complete hogwash, because it was really clear up to September 11th that the US was locked into a conflict of sorts with Osama bin Laden, the leader of this extremist group, Al Qaeda, in in the Middle East, and that there had been a number of conflicts between the two, the U.S. and Bin Laden, that is, leading up to 9/11, and it was clear that there was going to be some sort of big problem as a result of this um, uh, friction between the two. And so, a lot of history paints this as a rude awakening, a shock moment, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't a shocking moment. It shouldn't have been, at least. But there's no doubt that September 11th changed everything, because it really, apart from the coronavirus, there's never been a time in my life where I felt like a sense of fear that everyday, ordinary, normal life would be disrupted, and who knew when it would resume. Up until the coronavirus, the only other time I'd felt that was during 9/11. Everything was so uncertain for a couple of weeks. We didn't know if we were going to be attacked again. Now, the war on terror, which was launched in the aftermath, was a response to 9/11 that had widespread American support. A lot of people talk about endless wars, that the U.S. is always trying to fight wars of people, and these wars are very unpopular. But that's not the way people initially felt about the war on terror. The U.S. going into Afghanistan was seen as a moment of retribution for an attack on American soil. It was seen almost akin to Pearl Harbor, that there had to be a response to this affront. Now, the war in Iraq was different. A lot of people felt like the intelligence wasn't quite there, that Iraq hadn't been responsible for 9/11. And although the U.S. intelligence for Iraq having nuclear weapons, and therefore that the U.S. should intervene and should take Saddam Hussein out of power and dismantle Iraq's nuclear weapons program, although all of that was convincing, a lot of people still really felt like, there should be a limit to, America's interventions. But even so, that had much more support than people retroactively have made it seem. It was much more than 50-50. It's almost like 75-25. It seems supported the war in Iraq. Of course, after the fact, I'd say it's almost like 75-25, where people think that the war in Iraq was a mistake, with 75% people thinking that the war in Iraq was a mistake. And it was a mistake not because the U.S. had evil intentions. It's not because the U.S. was going in to steal Iraqi resources, oil, or any of that nonsense. I mean, I've looked at the diplomatic documents. I've done research alongside the civilian in charge at the Department of Defense, who was in charge of the campaign to convince Bush to go to war. And it's not about oil. It was about democracy. The Bush administration really had this approach to foreign policy that the U.S. had a responsibility to go in search of monsters to destroy, because obviously, because of 9/11, those monsters could come and could attack the U.S. And not only did the U.S. need to secure its borders at home by going abroad, but it could make the world a better place for everyone. And the idea was that if the U.S. goes into Iraq and takes out this really ruthless tyrant, Saddam Hussein, that it would serve as an example to the rest of the Middle Eastern dictators that they better change their ways. You had Gaddafi in Libya, who had a nuclear weapons program and had caused all sorts of problems, in the previous decades. And there was this feeling like, Iran was starting this nuclear program was going to be a global problem eventually. And it did become a problem. And it's clear that Iran did have a nuclear program. But the idea was that if the U.S. could democratize Iraq, then that would be a stepping stone to democratizing the entire Middle East. And the remorse that people have for the war in Iraq is an acute understanding about the limitations of American power. The idea that power is a trick of light, and just because America seems like it can project power so far and that it can make all these changes, is not able to do that. There's limits to American power, and there's limits to the unipolar thesis. And that was such a hard lesson because the US lost the war. It really did. It lost the war in Afghanistan. It lost the war in Iraq. And that's really, really hurt America's global standing. And it's hurt America's global standing at a point where where the world is poised for a transition to great power competition for the first time in a long time. And that great power competition is the rise of China, especially under the leadership of its current leader, Xi Jinping. Now, China has this remarkable story since the 1970s, where the US decided that it was going to try to bring China into the liberal world order, that excluding China was only going to make it an enemy, or keep it as an enemy, and that perhaps if the US could bring China into the fold, into the family of nations, into the liberal world order, that it could push China away from communism, and that it could bring China away from the Soviet Union and therefore isolate the Soviet Union even more to bring about Keenan's vision of a Soviet imposed collapse rather than a great power war to collapse the Soviet Union. And so Richard Nixon went to China, and this is called the opening to China, and it's this really remarkable moment. And China does open up under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. And this is this really important moment in world history because the US basically sowed the seeds of 21st century great power competition without realizing what it was doing. Because for the next decades, China emerged as this huge powerhouse where it's just had this astronomical economic growth, where it really improved the literacy and economic standing of its citizens, to the point where China has just been completely re-envisioned from what it was in the 1970s and the trajectory that it was on. And what's even more shocking is that China, rather than moving away from communism, created this new hybrid system of governance that fused communism and capitalism together in a way that nobody saw coming. And so China, by some measures, people see China as the second largest power, that it's no longer a unipolar world, that it's now a multipolar world between the US and China. And other people say that that's not true, that China actually has the largest economy in the world. And although its military technology is still about a decade behind the US, that it's pretty much in lockstep with the US, and they're pretty much equals. And that the trajectory that China is on is going to put China ahead of the US in the coming decades. Now, this is all hard to predict, but this is the greatest question of our age. And more importantly, China's path to doing this is a path built on world history. The current leader of China, Xi Jinping, looks at Chinese history and says that China made a number of decisions in its past, most notably scrapping its naval program in the 1500s when the Western European hegemons were starting up their naval programs, which kind of led to this rise of the West in the 1500s and created the sort of hegemonic system that we have in place. He says China made a big mistake by not competing, in that type of competition. And that's what led to China being in a position to lagging behind the West in the 20th century. And that China's going to um, make sure that it fixes that historical mistake. And so China's rise is very much conscious of China's history. And so that's kind of the point where we're at right now, this renewal of great power competition. And the question on a lot of people's minds is, how is the United States going to respond? Does it accommodate China? Does it leave room for China to grow? And does it kind of leave China to have its influence in its part of the world? And the US has its influence in its own part of the world. And that's that. Or does the US try to push back against China's rise and arm Taiwan, for instance, and make sure that China is not capable um, of doing to Taiwan what it's been able to do to Hong Kong? There's all of these really important questions. Does the U.S. go to war against China? I mean, these are not easy questions to answer, but this is the most important question of our age, hands down. And a lot of this is based off this history of, or this question of the end of American hegemony. Is America beaten down like it was in the 1970s after the Vietnam War? Or is this a momentary loss of confidence, just like there was a momentary loss of confidence that was eventually renewed in the 1980s? Will America reach a point where it starts to feel like it needs to compete again? Because right now, America has this national sentiment that it doesn't need to compete in the world, that it needs to end what people on both the left and the right, what Bernie Sanders and what Donald Trump has said, to end endless wars, which is a really silly concept. There's no such thing as endless wars. But there's this notion, nonetheless, of endless wars, and the U.S. needs to stop that. It needs to come home and not engage. And that's where the U.S. is now. And that's where the U.S. was in the 1970s. Whether the U.S. stays there is unclear, but that will really determine the course of world history in the 21st century, how the U.S. decides to end this question of the end of American hegemony. Now, this didn't begin under Donald Trump. This began under Barack Obama's presidency. Obama was really he really didn't take a leading position in America's alliance system. For instance, when there was all sorts of atrocities going on during the Arab Spring in 2011, when there was all these revolutions in the Middle East, and it seemed like liberalism was finally going to come to the Middle East, and perhaps the war on terror didn't reach its goal of a democratic Middle East as a result of U.S. power, but perhaps that intervention had inspired Middle Eastern actors to rise up and democratize their countries for themselves. And the European countries really took a pronounced role in stopping some of these dictators from rolling over their people. And Obama decided that the US was going to, what he called, quote unquote, lead from behind. And so there was all of these attacks on the institutions of the liberal world order because the US had always led from the front under the liberal world order. And Obama created this new vision of America leading from behind. So it didn't start with Trump, but Trump really took it a step further with this idea of America first, that this throwback to American isolationism, of an American first movement in the 1930s, where this idea that America shouldn't get involved in global affairs. There's a lot of parallels between, Donald Trump's America First and the America First under Charles Lindbergh. And that's all these sort of foreign policy questions, and it's compounded by economic questions as well, because the unipolar moment was buttressed by this idea of a global economic system that was underpinned by American strength, because American strength meant, well, Fukuyama's end of history thesis, no great power war, well, everyone is getting rich, right? Everyone's getting fat and rich, and there's not going to be any war. But and the economic system is going to be really successful and stable. And all of a sudden, we had this economic collapse in 2008 that showed that that wasn't true. And ever since then, there's been a lot of fear about the economic system. And there's all these theories now about so-called neoliberalism, that liberalism has been corporatized by policymakers, and that the state is too involved in decisions of economics. And it's all kind of hogwash in my view. But neoliberalism has become this neologism. Neologism means a newly coined word that people throw around to describe anything that they don't like. And people don't like the global economic system because they correctly perceive that there's a lot of inequity, which is true. And there's this really, really famous book that came out a couple of years ago by a French scholar named Thomas Piketty that I really recommend reading. It's called Capital, the 21st Century. And a lot of people consider it the Marx, the sort of contemporary Marx, where he looks at all of this inequality, Piketty that is, and he says, here's how we can fix the system. There's all these steps. And it's a really influential book. And um, anyone involved in policy has read it and is kind of thinking about it. So it's a really important book to read if you get a chance. But he argues really convincingly that there's too much capital in too few hands, and that there needs to be some sort of system of redistribution. I don't know if I agree with his ideas on redistribution, but it's a really important argument to be aware of nonetheless. But so a lot of people feel like this unipolar moment, this end of history, this this idea of neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, that people kind of go rewrite history to go back and say it's been in place since the 1950s, neoliberal economics. That all these things that have underpinned the liberal world order are all responsible for the problems in the world. And that everything needs to be torn down and renewed. There needs to be a reordering of the world. And while it's easy to see that there's a lot of problems with the world, a lot of people forget that reordering is an incredibly violent affair. Reordering is World War II. Reordering is World War I. Reordering is conflict, really bloody, violent conflict between great power states, all trying to vie for a balance of power and deciding how much power people are going to have after war. And that's the danger of tearing down systems, is when you tear down systems, you have to apply a new layer of order, both domestically and internationally. And so there's no easy answers. But I think one thing is clear, and I want to make it clear that historians make terrible fortune tellers, so I'm not going to predict the future. But one thing is clear: we've reached a crossroad where it seems like we're on the verge of a new sort of world order. And I'm not saying that that necessarily has to mean that there's going to be wars, but it does mean that there's going to be a lot of upheaval. And it's possible to say that maybe coronavirus has been that reordering, right? That coronavirus is going to show all of the problems in the world, and that there's going to be a shuffling of power. Some of the international institutions have already shuffled. The US has pulled out of the World Health Organization. And China's kind of now going to have a lot of influence over a really important international institution, which was a really big mistake on the Trump administration's fault. You don't want to give up your influence over international institutions. Even if you think there's problems with international institutions, you want to fix them from the inside, not from the outside. And there's this question of, if China is the largest economy in the world, then under the bylaws of the institutions that make up the liberal world order, they're actually required to move to Chinese territory, because they're required to be on the territory of whatever country has the strongest economy, which has been the US. but under some arguments, it's now China. So there's all these pivotal questions. I hope I've given a really clear bird's eye view. There's a lot of issues. Um, so let me know if you have any questions.